My name is Keith Strom. I'm the Executive Director of the Ernest Hemingway Foundation of Oak Park. And we want to welcome you to another discussion in our series of Hemingway in the 21st century. Tonight we've got Robert Elder joining us to celebrate Mythbusting Hemingway, Debunking Hemingway Myths, and Celebrating the Extraordinary Stories of His Life, which he co-authored with Thomas Bevilacqua. There you go, thank you. Tonight Rob, who a friend of the foundation, is an award-winning author and editor of 20-plus books, 4 of which are about tonight's subject, Ernest Hemingway. He's also president and CEO of the Outrider Foundation, which supports journalism and media about climate change and nuclear threats. He's a Montana native and is likewise a fellow Oak Parker. Moderating tonight's discussion, Carla Whitacre Mayer is a 20-year veteran of the book publishing industry and holds a master's degree in history and theology from Wheaton Graduate School. In 2020, Carla began visiting archives around the country, locating letters written by Hemingway's immediate family, with a particular emphasis on Hemingway's mother, Grace Hall Hemingway. So far, we've been told that she's read over 1,000 letters. That's a lot of Advil and optometrist appointments, I believe. But Carla currently serves as the program manager of education outreach here at the foundation. We welcome them both.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rob, for joining us today. One of the things we really love to do here is to try to encourage artists and cultivate writers. So one of the questions I really love to ask writers that come here is, what got you interested in writing? And then if you have anything that's kind of like a tip or something that you would say, that a habit maybe that you've cultivated or a skill you've developed that's helped you be successful as a writer.
So successful as a writer. Well, I always tell people, so I identify, first and foremost as a journalist.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
By training and inclination.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always tell people that being a journalist is the greatest job in the world because you're paid to be curious.
Yeah.
So that's what I feel like being a writer is. You're exploring this, you're indulging your own curiosity, you're learning about the world, and maybe you're exposing people to parts of the world or parts of their culture that they haven't experienced before. Because one of the things that I do, and my lovely wife has experienced this, when I run across a subject and I'm like, why hasn't anybody done a book about this? I have doomed myself to like 4 to 6 years into writing that book. So it's a blessing and a curse.
Yeah, okay. All right, very good. I also want to mention that Rob is the author of, it's going to be 4 books.
4 books.
4 books now on Hemingway. I have one of them here. This is Hidden Hemingway. So this is actually a look at the archive that is at the Oak Park Public Library that belongs to the foundation. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And it's more than just the archive.
Mm-hmm.
It's this house, it's the archive at the library, it's the library's private holdings, it's a little bit of the high school's holdings,
very good.
A little bit of the holdings at the OPRF River Forest Museum.
Oh, yeah.
So we have like 4 archives here, and this is a little smattering of all of them.
And it's beautiful pictures. It's fabulous to look at. And then recently you've released Hemingway in Comics.
Hemingway in Comics, the silliest book to ever get a contract, but it was great. And in fact, whether you know it or not, Hemingway shows up in comic books more than almost any other historical figure, including Abraham Lincoln. So I documented the 122 times that he shows up, either as Wolverine's sidekick or in Italian comic books, which is the last book. So we found all these Italian comics where they sort of gave their own spin on Hemingway stories, and that was just out last year. So it's great, and it's a traveling art exhibit now. That's
fabulous.
Yeah, it's up in northern Michigan right now, and I'm going to go give a speech in May.
That's great. That sounds so interesting.
It is so much Hemingway.
I have a few people in my family who will be lining up.
It is more Hemingway than my wife ever wants to hear about.
Yeah, that happens sometimes with the docents too. Our spouses get tired of hearing us talk. So we welcome guests from all over the world here to come in and to talk about Hemingway, and it is a constant daily effort to both listen to guests talk to us about stories they've heard about Hemingway that we know aren't true, and try to sort of gently, move them into something that's closer to, what has really happened in Hemingway's life. And even in our tours, we have to fact check ourselves all the time. So I know a myth-busting book needed to be done about Hemingway, because it's just, the myths about him are absolutely ubiquitous. They're everywhere.
Well, and not only that, but it obscures the truly amazing things that he did.
Yeah.
And said, and some of the truly awful things he did and said and whatnot. It makes him less human.
Yes.
So the myth of Hemingway has become larger than the human being and even his work.
Yeah, I think that's true. It strikes me, though, that, Betty White was born here in Oak Park, too. And I was thinking about this as I was preparing for the interview, that, not all celebrities need a book written about them that's myth-busting, right? Like, do we need a myth-busting book on Betty White? Probably not, right? But we do on Hemingway. So I just kind of want to get a sense of why you think it's so specifically needed for somebody like Hemingway.
It's just because he looms so large in our culture. Still.
He does.
Still. I mean, still in print. There was just, 6 hours that Ken Burns and Lynn Novick devoted to him. There are movies and adaptations. He is so saturated in our culture that it's important to separate the fact from the fiction.
Yep.
And this whole book came from when I was signing, this book.
Tell that story. That's great.
Yeah. So I have been lucky to be in a few of the places that Hemingway's lived. One in Key West, and their bookstore is amazing, but it is smaller than the size of this living room. And should we tell, by the way, for viewers on the internet, we are in Ernest Hemingway's living room.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yes. Grace and Dr. Hemingway's living room. And it's much smaller. This bookstore is much smaller.
Yes.
So they have all of their events outside. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so I was sitting at a table, like chatting with people. It was great. I tell anybody who wants to ask, like, I was lounging by the pool.
Yeah, right.
By Hemingway's pool, signing books.
Imagining you could live there.
Which was what I was really doing. It was like petting cats, staying in the shade, and trying not to die in Key West heat. And but as I was there, I listened to docent after docent come by and tell the story about this penny that's embedded next to the pool. And the story, the variation of it is like he was upset with his wife who who spent this extravagant money on a pool.
And got rid of his boxing ring.
All these sort of things. And I heard 7 different versions of the story, none of them, many of them contradictory.
Yes.
And so I was like, there has to be, like, what is the true story? And then I went and I talked to the director of the museum. He was like, I like everybody to put their own spin on it, which so offended me.
Yeah, just so you know, I don't say that here.
And it just does a disservice.
Yeah.
And then you find out. Actually, no. Buy the book. You'll find out what the real story is.
Yeah.
But we'll tell you. But we'll tell you a couple of things.
We'll pick a few.
And we'll because it's a lot. And again, my co-author is Thomas Bevilacqua.
Yes.
He did so much of this with me. My friend and co-author Mark Torino did a lot of this with us as well. And so this is not a solo event, solo effort, and you will see a lot of markers in here because there's so many facts I can't keep them all in my head. Mm-hmm. And so for myth busting, let's do it correctly.
Yes, sounds wonderful. Sounds good. So I love the scale that you use for your myths. You call it the Hemingway Truth-O-Meter. So I would just like to point out that Betty White does not need her own truth-o-meter, but okay, whatever. So you use the scale false, improbable, possible, probable, and true. Mm-hmm. So my question is, what was the most challenging myth to prove or disprove in this book?
So I think it's the last chapter, and I'll check here. So is anybody uncomfortable with me talking about suicide? Okay. So for this book, I ran into this in a couple of biographies. Mm-hmm. And even though Andrew Farah, who wrote an amazing book called Hemingway's Brain. Mm-hmm. Andy has said that this is the most famous suicide in American history, but so little is actually known about it. Mm-hmm. Initially Mary Hemingway, his fourth wife, said that it was an accident while he was cleaning his gun, but even the New York Times, in the initial report of it, makes it clear that it's a suicide. Where he placed the gun, all of these sort of things, because and again, I apologize for being too graphic, did he put the gun in his mouth or to his forehead? And depending on the biographer, there is no agreement on the circumstances. And even the story we get is, that night in Ketchum, Idaho, he and his wife Mary went out to a wonderful dinner, and he sang along with the band. And then she woke up in the morning and she heard what she thought was a drawer slamming, and it was a gunshot. But so much of that context is missing, and it's Mary telling the story from her point of view. We're trying to protect the legacy. Right. But if you hear what Patrick, his son, talks about, like, they were kind of estranged because he couldn't stand to be around them. They were drinking too much. They were arguing all the time. It was supposedly very toxic. His father had gone through several rounds of electroshock treatment at Mayo Clinic. And
we should point out, Patrick is Hemingway's son.
And Hemingway had attempted suicide more than once. One of his friends and editors wrote Papa Hemingway, A.E. Hotchner, and he talks about, at one point, Hemingway, when I don't think they're in Rochester, but there's someplace and they're flying, and he tries to walk into one of the propellers. Right. So it's this thing where the larger context is, according to Andy Farah, he's probably misdiagnosed. He probably has CTE, which is that brain injury that football players have. It's traumatic brain injury, and because of that, he was misdiagnosed, and his treatment was contributing to his already genetic depressive episodes, plus his alcoholism, plus all these other things. So we have this thing, and one of the things, I was lucky enough to be an artist in residence at his home in Ketchum. And the only dark lining to that is it's the place where he killed himself. It's not open to the public. They've converted the garage, which is underneath, into a lovely little writing space and an area that you can stay in. But they do give you a tour of the house. And one of the things that struck me was if you read about it in many of the biographies, they talk about the place where he shot himself as this little vestibule that's sort of off, to the side of the house. But when I got there, what I realized is it's the front door. And it seemed to me, if he wanted to go out gracefully, he could have made 2 steps to his left. And instead, it seemed like a hateful act or an act of revenge. None of this is scholarly. All of this is observation. The scholarly part of it was, we don't know so much of it. And again, depending on the place, and I talked to too many forensic scientists who talk about what the death scene looked like. And it's so grisly, let's not get into it. But it was the hardest thing, not only to write, but to research. And I went so far as to find there are only a few people at the scene, but I found the Ketchum doctor who attended the scene, and I found his private notes. Wonderful. Which are, I think they're at Princeton.
Yeah, wonderful.
So that was very hard.
Yes, I bet. That's a lot. That is a lot of research. And, clearly Mary was trying to obfuscate what had actually happened there.
It was very traumatic for her as well.
Absolutely. And as I understand it, she closed up that front entrance, because she couldn't walk past it every day.
Yes, that she always used a back and front entrance. But when you see the house, and it's a lovely house, I don't know how she lived there.
Right, absolutely. I had never thought about it being intentional on Hemingway's part, but I could definitely see that. All right, well, let's explain some of the myths that you talk about in this book.
And then I want to hear from the audience what myths you perhaps have. But go ahead.
So we'll hit a few. I'll tell you the one that I get the most often when I give tours here, and that is the one about the shortest story ever written. So, Rob, why don't you talk about that myth and then tell us what's true?
Yes, so it is this, it's the 6-word short story. And not only has this loom large, I've had people who are like, oh, this changed my life, his 6-word short story. And so the myth is that he was at the Algonquin's writers' table and they were challenging one another, and write the best short story. And so Hemingway cranked out a story that said, "For sale, baby shoes never worn." And so it actually sparked, I think, a couple of books. Like Salman Rushdie wrote one, and they solicit all these things, but it's completely apocryphal. He never wrote this. So my co-editor Thomas Bevilacqua wrote about this, and it's actually from a 1991 book. It's Peter Miller's "Get Published, Get Produced: A Literary Agent's Guide, a Literary Agent's Tips on How to Sell Your Writing." That's the only time it pops up.
Oh, interesting.
But there are other, if you go back, this has been debunked enough that other people have found versions of this in actual ads that existed before Hemingway was born. So there are versions of this. So it's not untrue. There are echoes of it. But the story being attributed to Hemingway way after his death is something we see a lot as we actually research the book.
Interesting. That is so interesting. All right, good.
So sorry, teachers out there,
Yes,
like
right.
it's a great writing exercise. But I even love when Peter Miller wrote this story, the first word is apparently. So that's your clue right there.
Right.
Apparently.
Right.
So
that's the get out of jail free card.
yes, yeah.
All right, so another myth that I've heard a couple of times is that Hemingway killed Nazis when he was being a journalist in World War II. So tell us about that one.
That one's also a little harder because he told people that.
Yes. And this is not uncommon.
Yes. He was his own fabulist
Yes.
in many ways. And some may say a perpetrator of stolen valor. So for those of you who know, he was either a part of or covered several wars. World War I, he was wounded as an American Red Cross volunteer. He covered the Spanish Civil War. He covered World War II. And, he was embedded with a unit. And from his own writing, we know that he participated in shooting, which he absolutely should not have done. It was against the Geneva Conventions. He was almost court-martialed for it. And there's like this little, in 1944, there was a little informal interview, and the notes survive. He was called before an Army Inspector General following his actions in August, when he, quote, liberated the Ritz Hotel.
The bar specifically.
Yes, just the bar with partisans. The interrogation led to this memorable exchange. Inspector General, were there mines in your room? Hemingway, there were no mines in my room. I would greatly prefer not to have mines in my room.
Fair.
So, but, we do find he had this little pocket journal.
Yeah.
Mark Trino pointed to this, and he talks about shooting a German soldier 3 times before he stopped. And this is a quote: "I was in the back of a pillbox, and I killed the one," and he crosses it out. He crosses out, killed the one, and he shot the one in back of us across the road, and. Again, it's noticeable that he says he crosses out killed and puts in shot.
Yeah.
And he told this story to kind of anyone who would listen, including Pablo Picasso.
Yes.
And when he met Picasso in Paris after the war, and he gave Pablo, I think there were badges he had ripped off a uniform. And Picasso's take on this was, if Hemingway had shot anyone, he would not have needed trophies.
That's interesting. That's an interesting interpretation.
So, but and also to put this in just proper perspective, Chris Kyle, who is, he's the soldier of American Sniper fame. Also unfortunately a little bit of a fabulist. He was accused of plumping up his own autobiography, but his army record, like literally his confirmed kills. He was credited with 160 kills over his career, over his lifetime.
Yes.
Hemingway claimed to do that in a summer. So Yes.
That might be a clue.
It might be a clue. It might be a clue. And again, the number 122 is very important to him. It pops up in other pieces of his work as well.
Okay, so do you know why 122? I have heard that. Why?
So Mark Trino, really, my colleague,
Yes.
is really the expert on this. But it shows up in Across the River and Into the Trees.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And it's when he talks to his young Italian girlfriend, he talks about the number of people killed, and the quote is 122 sures, not counting possibles.
All right.
So it does show up. It's a number that sticks with him.
Okay, interesting. All right, well, one of the things, and I know I have read this too, that Hemingway didn't date much in high school.
Yes.
And so he's sort of seen as just not being that into, I don't know, is he not, sometimes people imply he's not that into girls, but that's not really true. But it is true that he actually had several girls that he was infatuated with. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, it's implied that he doesn't, or he's not interested in girls by his own classmates. Like, that's why the myth persisted.
Yes,
Like, that's the problem. So, Louis Clarahan said he did not care to date and avoided girls, like, on the record. Like, this is something he told, multiple biographers. And Susan Lowry, he said he preferred to go hunting and fishing. If any classmate can say he ever saw Ernie take a girl to a dance or a school party, I don't know who that person was. And it also is like, if he ever went to a dance and his date wasn't his sister.
Yes, right.
Who knows?
Exactly. Yeah, and that part of that is this family was very much against dancing, and so he was only allowed to go with his sister.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that was interesting because it popped up in a couple of places. But what I started to find, and this is my one claim to Hemingway scholarship fame.
All right.
Is I found 3 different women he dated. So one of them, he actually wrote a poem to, Annette DeVoe. Mm-hmm. It's actually in Hidden Hemingway. Mm-hmm. And one of those lines is, "Your matchless grace, your sensuous loveliness, and your beauty strikes me dumb." And what I loved about doing this, and so, Annette was sort of a background character. She shows up in his letters. I just loved sort of following the breadcrumbs, mm-hmm. and it was my sort of journalist's job to just like call up, sometimes people in nursing homes and say, "Did your grandmother date Hemingway?" And in 2 cases, literally in 2 cases, Annette DeVoe and Frances Coates Grace, not only did they date him, or they were at least socially with him. I mean, with Francis Coates, he was really in the friend zone. Yeah. Like, it was hard for him to break out. They kept his high school picture for years, in a very interesting way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they did.
And then there was a third woman named Catherine Longwell, who is this beautiful singer with a sultry voice, mm-hmm. and he also had some romantic ties to her.
Oh,
and so I wrote about them in several places. The Paris Review, I wrote for the Chicago Tribune. I wrote it in at least 2 books now. But these relationships are important because it's also the Coates Grace family. They were told that one of the reasons that he got infatuated with this nurse, Agnes von Kurowski, is that Effie, it was what her family called her, wasn't interested. Like if you just hold on, mm-hmm. And the letters, we found like these 99-year-old letters that later went up for auction.
Wow.
And in a couple of cases, again, that's my one corner of fame, is that I was able to find these women and these families, and it was a lot of fun.
That's fabulous. Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah. And it makes me think there's more out there. Like, in Oak Park, people, I'm sure, have attics full of letters, and Grace's paintings keep popping up every once in a while. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some stuff there.
Yeah, my other job is a professional genealogist, and I run into this often, where you get talking to somebody and they're like, "Oh, I think I have a box of her letters somewhere." Yeah. So it's definitely possible. Yeah, definitely, absolutely. All right, so wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that, or the myth, I'll say it's the myth, I guess, that Grace dressed Hemingway as a girl. So Hemingway's mother dressed Hemingway as a girl. So, yeah, so we're going to have a lively discussion about this because I actually think that Rob and I actually see it a little differently too. So this will be interesting. So Rob, tell us about the myth.
So it is strictly true.
Yes.
She did dress him as a little girl.
Yes. In fact, I can send a picture. Right?
Yes, and so we can show this around.
So you can take this and then just pass it around. And Hemingway, just so you know, I'm going to pass around a picture. It's two girls standing, and it's Hemingway and his older sister Marceline dressed as twin girls. If you want to know which one Hemingway is, he's the one holding his crotch.
Yes. And so that is a story that is absolutely true.
Yes.
The nuance of it is that she always wanted twins. Grace always wanted twins, and in fact wanted them to enter grade school as twins. And so she gave Marceline an extra year of kindergarten and perpetuated this myth. Now, they were dressed both as little girls and little boys, often also up in Michigan.
Yes.
And so it's absolutely true.
Yes.
Now, where you get into where scholars have different opinions about this is some will say, oh, it was a charming Victorian tradition. Verna Kale, who is a scholar who I just adore, and she's done a lot of amazing work, will say, Grace was, she was like an Instagram mother. She was just creating these moments. But the thing that I find interesting is, and many of you may know this, that later in Hemingway's life, and actually most through all of his married life, he was very interested in gender fluidity. Yes. That he would gender swap with his wives. Mary was the largest part of this later in his life.
Yes.
He liked to be called Catherine later in life. And so you will find disagreement among scholars and say, this had nothing to do with that, which is strange.
Yeah.
Like, really? One did influence the other one at all? Tell me your perspective.
Okay.
Because I have another layer.
Buttoning my lip here. Yeah, no, he's absolutely right. So Grace did dress Hemingway Grace did dress Hemingway in girls' clothes. But one thing we learned from Marceline is that they had a big trunk of costumes, and they were always dressing up. And I think I never thought of it as being an Instagram mother, but that has been rooting around in the back of my mind. Like, spend any time on TikTok, you're going to see some crazy mothers out there, right? So people that dress their kids up as watermelons and every other thing that you can find. So yeah, she loved that whole dress up thing, and I think she really wanted to impart a sense of creativity, in the kids. The other thing is that at that point, boys could wear dresses until they were potty trained, so that could be till 3. So it wasn't that the picture that I passed around is normal in the sense that was how he dressed every day. But I would say it wasn't quite as weird as we might think of it today. And the other thing I want to point out is who is taking the picture. His father is taking that picture. So if that is something that horrified his father, I don't think he would have wanted to capture it on film.
One more bit.
Go for it.
But they did think it was weird. Grace, or Marceline, thinks it's weird. And it goes until the 2nd grade. It goes into the 2nd grade when she rebels and she cuts her hair and refuses to be twinned anymore. And her mother shames her by making her wear a baby's bonnet.
Yes.
And at that point, the teacher steps in and says, this is enough.
Yes. Yes. Now, but those are two different issues. The twinning and dressing him as a girl are two different issues.
Oh, no. They're the same issue, I think. Okay. Because it is still twinning. And they were dressed that way until literally the children refused. The other thing is Marceline says this. She says it in the book At the Hemingways, and as I went through the archives here, that picture that you're passing around, and there's another one that says 2 little girls in their peonies. They have flowers in their hands.
Yes.
There's a copy of that photo, and in Marceline's handwriting she says, this photo did not make it into my book. So not only the family knew it was
That's
unusual.
Fabulous. I love that.
And like I said, you will find honest disagreement about what kind of impact that had on him.
Yes.
To me, it makes all the sense in the world that he would become hyper-masculine, that he would maybe want to distance himself as far away from this as possible. And not only that, like, I think he was so protective of his privacy, you know, and this doesn't reflect well on him, but, you know, he wrote in Esquire that, like, you know, I went back to Chicago, and I went back to Oak Park, and the place where my home was a hot dog stand. Like, it's still here. And not only that, but the 3 houses he did live in Oak Park are still here.
Yeah.
You know, they're still standing. One of them is in a different place,
Yes.
but they're still here. But he also threatened his mother and said, if you ever talk to, I think it was, I don't know if it was Life or if it was Esquire, but said, if you ever talk to a journalist, I will cut you off. You will be financially...
Yes. After Hemingway's father committed suicide, Ernest Hemingway is the one that supports Grace. And so he lays it on the line. He says, you talk to the press, I take the money.
Yeah.
And that was her livelihood.
And he tells the press that too. Like, if you interview my mother, done.
Yeah.
So... again, that is a dotted line, but he's very protective of his privacy, of his legend, and again, this sort of hyper-masculine myth that he builds during his lifetime.
Yes.
You know, even one of the things I found, my darling wife has spent too much time in antique stores with me, yeah, I just heard her scoff. And one of the things I found actually in an antique store was this Book of the Month Club. And I forget which book it's for. I think we talk about it in here. But they even talk about the myth of Hemingway. And it's his editor who is supposed to have written it. And it is so full of actual falsehoods during Hemingway's lifetime.
Yes.
In part, it's Hemingway's own fault.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. He was a very, very, very private person. So, I mean, I was thinking, I recently heard Barbra Streisand interviewed, and she said that she didn't give interviews anymore. And the part of the reason she didn't give interviews was that she got tired of people getting information wrong. But the problem is then there's a vacuum, right?
Yes.
And all kinds of things will end up filling up the vacuum.
Yeah.
So, interesting. All right, well, that debate will go on. Okay, so one of the things that's really great about the book is that you include some new scholarship. So there's a couple of sort of newer finds that have come along. One of them is the Toby
Bruce?
Yes, thank you, Toby Bruce. Toby Bruce collection at Penn State. So Toby worked for Hemingway, was a friend of Hemingway's, and collected a lot of things just being around Hemingway, and that recently was sold to Penn State.
Yep.
So tell us about what you found there that was interesting or helpful in this book.
So this, so Brewster Chamberlain, who was a Hemingway scholar in Key West, and along with Sandra Spanier, had been looking after this sort of little-known archive. I mean, people in Hemingway circles knew that it existed, but basically what happened was after Hemingway's death, Mary came through, and he had stored a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of trunks in the back of Sloppy Joe's, his favorite watering hole in Key West. And so what she did is she just went through everything and took what she wanted, and she left everything else in the care of the Bruces. And Toby Bruce was sort of his like driver and his like Mr. Fix-It. He built the fence around the house in Key West, and so he and his wife had an amazing treasure. The stuff that Mary didn't take was still pretty amazing. And one of the things that we found, or that Sandra and Brewster found, was a book in which, so not only did they find what is likely his first short story that he wrote, I think when he was like 9, but they also found this book that had been referenced before by his first biographer, Carlos Baker, but it talks about Hemingway, or Hemingway writes about in this sort of like blank book, different ways he would kill himself in his 20s. So his suicidal ideation is with him his entire life. I've talked to scholars that said it's amazing he made it to 61. But that little piece, also the fishing logs from Pilar are in that archive, his beloved boat.
Okay.
So there's always something new.
Yes.
And the interest for him in his life and his work continues to amaze me.
It does. And there were some really interesting pictures in that collection, too.
Yeah.
You have one of Hemingway that's in the book, and he's on a bike. What's really interesting about it is that when he goes over to World War I, he is only there for a couple of weeks before he ends up getting injured. And so this picture is caught during that time period.
Yeah.
And so you are looking at the face of a man whose life is going to change dramatically within days. And if you look at the picture, you'll see, too, he looks so young to me.
So young.
I mean, you could put him in his graduation gown. I mean, he's
At the same time, also looks like Tom Cruise in Top Gun.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, like at the same time, like
He is
boyish,
handsome.
but also right in the danger zone.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is true. That is
Yeah.
very, very true.
Yeah.
That is very true. Yeah. Okay, so another piece of scholarship that you came across was somebody from Oak Park that lived in a house where Grace lived for a while. So you
Are
want to tell
they
us?
here? No, they're not here. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So you want to tell us about that?
Yes. So, and again, because this is so, I'm going to screw up the names because
It's Jim Hopkinson.
Hopkinson and his wife, and they actually came to an event for
Yes.
Hidden Hemingway,
Yeah.
and they just said, "Hey, we think we have this letter," and what it was a letter to Grace, the mother, from her brother. Lester, and she loved Lester so much she named their son Lester. And it was this letter which talks about, like, I am so sorry, I haven't been able to, like, really function. And he describes basically a depressive fugue state. And so what that is, and it's the first time in Hemingway scholarship we have concrete proof that there were sort of, like, if not tendencies, then genetic markers on both sides of his family.
Yeah.
And it's this heartbreaking existential letter.
Yeah.
And again, that was found a couple of years ago here.
Right.
What else do we have, people? This is a call.
Yes, right.
Contact
Check your ad.
Carla or Keith Strom. I'm hard to avoid on the internet. Find me. But there's so much more scholarship out there to do. Yeah.
So Jim Hopkinson had purchased the house that Grace lived in, and I don't know where in the house they found it.
No, they just were, like, given it as part of the house.
Oh, okay. It
Like,
was
and they
left
got a
with it.
book, and they got
Yeah.
a couple of other things,
Yeah.
which I think have, I don't know their fate. Keith, do you know, were they donated to the collection?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah. All right.
Jim, let us know.
All right. The other thing that you found, this again is very much like the genealogy work I do. This is fabulous. You found a letter that was written by one of Hemingway's girlfriends, Frances Coates, that Carla Whitacre had wanted to interview her, and she was very reluctant to do that.
Yes.
Now, the way I read it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that part of the reason she was reluctant is that she actually was like almost engaged to a boyfriend who was off at military training when she was sort of flirting with Hemingway, but they weren't really together. Is that fair?
Kind of, sort of. Kind of, sort of.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she is nervous about talking about it, but she writes the letter that she never sends. And
Yes.
so this is what you find,
Yeah.
which is fabulous.
And so she writes him after the biography comes out. Carla Whitacre, this, again, towering figure in Hemingway scholarship, and sort of compliments him and says, "You get this right, you get this right. You know, thank you so much." And what she says is basically she doesn't want to become part of the, like, Hemingway I knew him when myth.
Yeah.
You know, like, she doesn't
Hanger on.
want
She
she doesn't
doesn't
want to
hang
cash
on.
in on that.
Yeah.
She still feels very warmly toward Hemingway and his memory. At the same point, you know, there's Betsy Fermano, who's her granddaughter, who I met and who actually I corresponded with this morning because you found a photo of
Yes.
this. Are they in this room? Or are they in the other room?
No, it's in the other house.
It's in the other house.
It's in the other house.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's of these Italian parties they would have after Hemingway came back and was wounded. They would have Italian musicians and Italian food, and it was great. And Carla said, "I think this is Frances. Is this?" And so I sent it to her grandmother. She's like, "Oh yes, that's totally her." So it's lovely that we can sort of, you know, connect all these things. I got so excited I forgot your question.
Oh, no, I was just, the part of the new scholarship that came out was this remembrance that, that Frances had written
So
and
she,
sent to.
so she sort of fills in this hole about what it was like to grow up with Hemingway. And, you know, she talks about him as this sort of like puppy who's tripping over his own feet, and he's awkward, And also there's a really interesting description of his mother. His mother is a formidable force in his life.
Yes, she has actually, yeah.
Yeah, and talks about, did she call her a battleship? She calls her like something.
I'll see if I can find it.
Even then she knew what a powerful force, for better or for worse, that she was in Hemingway's life.
Yeah.
And so all these years later, we get an accounting of what it was like to grow up with him in the 19-teens.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, and this is the first time it's ever been in print, in a mass market way.
Yeah.
So we're happy to offer that.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I found it interesting that several times she said that he had an inferiority complex. So that's kind of her take on him. I was going to see if I could find what. This is her description of Grace. A big, majestic woman, a singer in her youth, naturally a contralto. She moved as a ship does, with great majesty and authority. So
much more complimentary than I remember it. But that's great.
We could talk about that too. Okay, so what myth in this book that do you think? Because some of this is in certain ways trivia, right? Some of it is like things that happened in his life. But what are the myths that or a myth that you feel like really affected who he was as a person? Like whether this myth is true or not, how he developed as an artist?
So much of it is not how it affected him, but how he portrayed himself. So the 122 kills during World War II, not great. Carlos Baker was fond of saying, because Hemingway's anti-Semitism has been pretty well documented now, and he has sort of said, it was only skin deep, because in his class and in his circle, anti-Semitism is almost a
given.
Not just a given, but a way they express humor, like because he called himself Hemingstein in his letters, but it's a Bierstein as well. So Carlos sort of dismisses it. Thomas and I do not dismiss it. There's some pretty unflattering stuff that, again, should not be excused, but it helps to understand him as a whole human being.
Right. Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, Hemingway is one of the most researched American authors, if not the most researched American author. And it continually surprises me how many books still come out about Hemingway every year, and we're so far on past his passing. So I guess I'm curious what you think is left undone in the world of Hemingway. Is there anything left undone in the world of
There are always things that will surprise you. And I think the reason we are fascinated by him is he lived in the most interesting and dangerous times, in the most beautiful places. He married 4 strong, independent women.
Remarkable women.
And he wrote so many letters that there's a series that I think it's like 22,000 letters. And because I keep finding more, it's going to be more than 22,000 letters that come out. So it is one of these things because I'm not the only person to have written this, but people have said like, oh, he was a pack rat. He's a hoarder. Really, like
That's why we find trunks everywhere.
Oh yeah. But it's one of these things like somebody wrote that Hemingway kept every piece of paper he ever wrote on, and I kind of joke he kept every piece of paper he touched. This weird thing, not like research, and in the archives here we have, if not, I don't know, it's more than 20 wine cards on a ship. Where he had to sign for the wine bottles in one. He drank too much.
He kept the receipts for his wine glasses.
So he drank too much, and we have proof of that. But he just kept so much.
Yeah.
And that is the thing. And I tell like other families of authors, like if you want to keep them in the public interest, this sort of documentation and that sort of stuff is necessary. But I think, there are a lot of unknowns. We don't have Agnes von Karowski's letters that he wrote her. She destroyed them.
Yes.
I would love one to accidentally show up.
Right.
There's a bunch of mysteries. I think all of you or many of you know. His Juvenilia, the work that he wrote in high school and then in his early career before A Farewell to Arms was lost because his wife tried to bring it on vacation, including the carbons. And so that trunk was either lost or stolen in Paris. I would love to see that pop up.
Oh yes, wouldn't we all?
Yeah. So there are a bunch of things. The gender fluidity, I think, has been explored and will continue to be explored. Yeah. He's a fascinating guy.
Yeah, he is absolutely true. Yeah, you describe him as being difficult, driven, and complex.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe we've already hit on this because we've talked about the fact that he's got all these unflattering faults, but yet we're still interested.
Well, it's because the work is so good. Like that's the thing. Like his style now, people don't realize. Like it was this avant-garde thing.
Yeah.
And now it's just what we think of as sort of like the engine of most American writing.
Yes,
it's been
you're right.
parodied
It was
so much. It was shocking at the time. It was so well metered and well measured, and it was sort of like poetry with the repetition that people forget that. I hope, one of the reasons I wrote this book is he has become larger than his own work.
Yes.
That we talk about Hemingway, the man, and the things surrounding him, oftentimes more than we talk about his actual writing. And I'm hoping that refocuses a little bit.
Yeah, fair. That's very fair. Yeah. Because I think a lot of the things people say about Hemingway, whether he was a racist or whether he was this or whether that, you would answer those questions differently from things that you've heard about his interactions versus his work. If you look at his work, I think you get different answers to some of those questions.
And again, if you watch that documentary, people are like, oh, he hated women. I was like, and Edna, is it Farber? What's her name? She's the Irish writer. O'Brien. Says where? Like, show me where.
Yes, right.
And
you're looking at his work.
And actually talks about how sensitive he is toward female characters.
Right.
So a lot of it becomes larger than life, farther from the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. All right, so we're interested in what questions you have as far as myths that you've heard about Hemingway or one that you want Rob to address.
I actually have two quick ones, and they both have to do with Michigan.
Okay, I have to repeat them, just so you know.
Okay. So I have heard, we spent a lot of time in northern Michigan, my family and I've heard he and his buddies, when they were teenagers, hiked from Oak Park to the cabin up in Wildwood Lake, like over a several-week period.
Okay.
And they hiked through the area that it's in Arcadia, Michigan, very small. Anybody along M22 will tell you that story, anybody who lives there. They hiked from Oak Park all the way up to, which is a long hike, even if you take several weeks. The other one has to do with the Big Two-Hearted River, and that Nick Adams did actually fish the Big Two-Hearted River. He fished the Fox River because, as any good fly fisherman would do, you would never reveal where you fish.
Yes.
Okay, so there's two questions. I have to try
Those are just two that I've heard related.
So the first question was whether did Hemingway actually walk from Oak Park up to their cabin up near Petoskey, right?
Yeah.
And then the other question, I'm not sure I can recount this, but whether he actually fished in...
Whether Nick actually fished the Big Two-Hearted River.
Whether Nick actually fished...
Because in there, that's what he talks about.
Okay.
Any good fly fisherman would never reveal where he fishes.
Okay, did Nick
Being a
actually...
fisherman would know that.
And there are two great books about Hemingway in Michigan. There are more actually now. But yes, that theory is that it's the Fox River is well known. Do you have an opinion?
No.
Yeah. And I was talking to somebody, like there's a beer now called what's it?
Or Two-Hearted Ale.
Two-Hearted Ale.
Yeah.
So he lives on. As for the hike, there are photos of him hiking, but I don't think it's all the way to Petoskey. I thought it was like Lake Zurich. Do you remember where they're going?
I don't know. There are definitely pictures of him.
I've heard that too, but I've also heard the one where he hiked up to Walden.
So here's what I thought, but I could be wrong too. They took a train part of the way, but they walked part of the way too. So it was this kind of combo.
But there's a lot of great photos, so you can find that.
Yeah.
And I've been talking to Keith about this for years. We do know that he took a canoe trip to Starved Rock with his teenage buddies. And I was actually talking with our friends. I'm like, what would it take to recreate that trip? answer a lot more portaging.
Yes.
A lot more carrying the canoes and the boats than Hemingway would have to do.
Yeah.
But
The fishing one cracks me up though, because I'm a fly fisher myself, and I don't typically tell people where we go. It's just, you don't do that, because otherwise everybody should.
Everybody
shows
shows up
up.
at your fly fishing place.
The
Okay.
fishermen use that
Yes.
as a writer, I just think it's hilarious.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think it's likely. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Who else? Yes, sir.
We say he doesn't ever come back to Oak Park other than his father's funeral in 28. True, and does he not come back to Chicago either?
So from my memory, I don't think he does. I mean, I don't see any other sort of timeline that he does come back. I think partially it's too painful. He's also he's not at war with his mother.
Oh well,
Maybe he's at war with.
It was a troubled relationship.
It was a troubled relationship,
Yeah.
but also like he doesn't approve of who Sunny, his younger sister, wants to marry. So the whole area is tangled up, and he's off covering wars and whatnot. But to my knowledge, that remains true. He didn't come back after his father's funeral.
I wonder too if it might have had something to do with the fact that he liked to tell people that he grew up poor. Look around you.
Yeah.
Does this look like this man grew up poor?
Yeah.
So you're not going to show off a place that you said didn't exist, right?
No.
You said it had been turned into a hot dog stand.
Yeah, no, it wasn't there anymore. And also, like, the thing that is so interesting, we talk about Grace Hall, she was such a self-made woman. She made more than her doctor husband
Yes.
giving music lessons.
Yes.
And made so much money. And this is also part of the inheritance that Grace up in Windermere, that was the family,
Yes.
the house that's still there.
Yes.
She had another house built across the lake, so she could have a little bit of peace. So not poor. That's what we're trying to say. Not
Yeah.
poor.
And that's Grace up there, by the way, if
Yes.
anybody wants to see a picture of Grace. Okay.
Yes.
I have a question. So when he was growing up, did he go and walk down Chicago Avenue to the Des Plaines River to fish, or is that a myth?
I know he was in the Des Plaines
probably.
a lot.
Yeah, I would
yeah,
say,
like
yeah.
quite a lot. And not only that, but if you want to look it up, well, you can read it in the book, and you can also look. I have pictures of him on the Des Plaines River with Francis Coates. So it was also a place where he took dates. So he loved to canoe in the Des Plaines. And again, the Des Plaines goes all the way down to Starved Rock. Let's do it, Keith. What else? What else?
How about the quote about Oak Park being a place of broad lawns and narrow minds?
I can't believe we didn't tackle that
I
one
had
first.
It on the list.
Yeah.
I had it on the list, and they took it out.
So Carlos Baker, again, his first biographer, tried to source this, that Oak Park was a place of wide lawns and narrow minds.
Right.
It is such a good line that perhaps it captured what Hemingway might have thought about Oak Park. He jokes that his latest book was The Sun Also Rises could be burned on the steps of the Oak Park Library.
Yeah.
He jokes about this, but we can't find it. And also, we also know that Hemingway, when he had a good line, was not afraid to repeat it and would share it in multiple letters. So I can't imagine that he said that or wrote that and didn't repeat it a few times. But as far as I know, apocryphal. Carlos Baker still includes it and says, I couldn't find it anywhere. So it's illustrative, but it's not true.
Yeah, like he might not have said those words, but in some ways that's almost beside the point, because I think it is how he felt.
It is
exactly.
how he
Someone
felt.
said him somewhere. It would be fun to find out who.
Yeah. But
absolutely.
for now. Yes, sir.
I wonder if Hemingway and Frank Lloyd Wright ever expressed any awareness of I'm one for the other.
We tried. We could not find anything. And the closest we ever came, and first tell me if you found anything. Did you find anything?
I just understand that they were in Venice, both Frank Lloyd Wright and Hemingway were in Venice, and they got into an argument via the media, but I don't know that they actually ever met.
Yeah, and here's the other thing, because they were generationally apart.
So Frank Lloyd Wright would have been, I typically say Hemingway's parents' generation, but I think it was actually a little older than
Yeah, just a little older. So we, And I haven't actually found any quotes where they talk about one another. That's the other thing.
Yeah, just this one Venice thing. I think there's some construction going on in it's in Italy. I think it's Venice. And Frank Lloyd Wright has an opinion, and Hemingway doesn't agree with him. But this only happens in the newspaper. It doesn't happen face to face.
And I can't find a biography even with it. So we'll talk. But one of the interesting things is, so Hemingway. So I used to be editor-in-chief of the Oak Leaves, which was one of the newspapers here. And 32 and 31 other newspapers.
Okay.
And in fact, it's how I ended up doing Hidden Hemingway, my first book, where I had one of my reporters say, like, yeah, I think Hemingway used to write for us. And I said, aren't we a goddamn newspaper? Shouldn't we know? And what I found was that Hemingway didn't write for the Oak Leaves, but he was published in the Oak Leaves. When he wrote home, when he was wounded in World War II, or World War I, a letter home was published in the Oak Leaves. So he didn't write for the Oak Leaves. But more interesting, he was a paper boy for the Oak Leaves. So he delivered the paper, and we tried to reconstruct what his route would have been, and there was some talk that we think that the Wrights were on his route.
Oh,
The only other tie that we have is part of the archives here in Oak Park are all of the manuscripts for At the Hemingways, which is Marceline Hemingway's remembrance of growing up in Oak Park.
So all the versions that she did, drafts.
And in one of those drafts is a story that does not make it into the final version, where she talks about going to a birthday party at the Wright's house. And this would have been when Frank had absconded with, which wife did he go to Spring Green with? Mama, where he absconds with Mama. So this would have been during that time, but it doesn't make it into the book. So that's the only tie I've ever been able to find.
So it was one of the children he left in Oak Park when he ran away.
All of the children that he left.
All of the children. He left all of them, but that's who the birthday party was.
Yeah, there was something, and Marceline makes a passing reference. But that's all I've ever been able to find.
I've often wondered what Grace's response was to Frank Lloyd Wright taking
she
off.
She would have been scandalized.
She would have been scandalized by it. And I also wondered if she would have provided support to his wife here, because she was left with these kids and no income. So, interesting.
I think Wright was a pretty good reader, and so and his library, I think, was cataloged. It existed. It existed after he died. So I don't know if Hemingway's books ever got into.
I have asked docents at Taliesin and Taliesin West. Nobody can tell me. So perhaps I am leaving the Hemingway scholarship field. I think 4 books is enough. So those of you out there, Volume 2, Mythbusting Hemingway, please, there's plenty out there.
You go check your attics. We'll figure out.
And we have a thread here that needs to be pulled at.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions?
Anybody else? Great, we've solved it all.
Right, I think so. Fabulous. Well, we thank you so much for coming tonight and sharing in this experience. We congratulate you on your book, and this is really exciting to see it come out. So, Rob, do you want to talk about the... Okay, so we do have Rob's book out there, and I have a feeling Rob will be willing to sign them.
I will sign them,
yes. If you buy a book tonight. So feel free to check into that. All right, anything else, Keith? Are we good?
No.
All right, great. Well,
thanks, everybody.
You so much.
Thank you. That's really good.